kinds of votes, right? You can vote with your ballot, your wallet, or your feet, and call those respectively election, migration, transaction, right? And all three of those are used, for example, in U.S. The political context, where obviously there's elections. There is migration because there's federalism. You can move between states and so on. Move to Puerto Rico, move to Hawaii, whatever, right? And then there's transaction. People can make political donations. That's legal. You can donate to PACs, you can donate to your candidates, et cetera. And you can sort of think of this as, there's several things that can be said. First is when you vote with your ballot, the cost is quite low. It's just going 2 hours to the polling station or filling in a mail order thing, but your impact is quite low also. You have a 1 out of n chance of being the tie-breaking vote, right? When you vote with your wallet, the cost is higher. Let's say you max out at 2,300 or whatever the threshold is. I believe it's 2,300. The impact is harder to measure, but there's people who have done something like the number of dollars spent per vote or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so roughly speaking, to very crude approximation, when you spend $2,300, you're effectively getting more than one vote. You're quote buying votes by donating to a candidate, whether Democrat or Republican. You may argue that that is a bad thing, but there's some argument that it's there. If it's a 100-to-1 ratio of dollars to votes, then you're buying 23 votes when you donate $2,300, right? Okay, so you have a somewhat higher impact than 1 over n. You've now gone up to 23 over n or something like that, right? Okay. And then the third is migration, when you're actually spending more than probably 2,300. It might be 10,000 or tens of thousands of dollars to move, right? But now you have a very high percentage chance of changing the law under which you live, because you have selected that jurisdiction based on its legal characteristics in part, right? Mm-hmm. For example, it has more liberal marijuana laws, or it is friendlier to the LGBT community, or it has better regulations on crypto, or some combination of those things, right? And so these three forces are all considered legitimate, right? Like that, say all three of them operate in our current context. And what is happening is technology is changing the balance of power of these forces. And what I argue is that you're going to see this century have, election is still important, right? Vote with ballot is still important, but vote with wallet and especially feet will become even more important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And, one way of thinking about this, again, from like a legitimacy standpoint is, America is not just a nation of immigrants. Tautologically, every immigrant's an emigrant. So America is a nation of emigrants with an E, right? And the most American thing in the world is to leave your home and search for a better life, right? So right now, we have political leaders in the West who are selected for legitimacy, but not for competence. Okay, so one way of thinking about that, and I'll give another framework here, which I think of as founding versus inheriting. Okay. Mm-hmm. Why is Zuckerberg the CEO of Facebook? Because he founded it. Why is a political leader, the governor or the mayor or the president of a region? Because they won an election, right? Founding and inheriting are the two major ways. You might say, okay, I understand founding. Why would you say winning an election is inheriting? Well, in an important sense, a lot of the East Coast is about inherited institutions. In the most basic sense, that's inherited wealth. You're inheriting, some, large family fortune, like, the Rockefellers or what have you, DuPonts, et cetera. I'm not attacking them, just saying that does exist. There's old money on the East Coast, right? But in a somewhat, you might also inherit a newspaper, right? Like, the Grahams or the Murdochs or Sulzbergers inherit a newspaper, right? That's a more important thing. That's not just money. That is a serious form of power that's being inherited. But maybe the least obvious but most important thing is when people win an election, they are inheriting a organization that they could not have built from scratch, right? So, George Washington assembled basically the U.S. military from scratch, right? And, there was a New York mayor who, basically put together the NYPD. Or there are guys like Robert Moses who, for his many faults, just built a ton of transportation infrastructure, right? Managed to corral all the resources to do that. You might say he did bad things, but he was certainly able to impose his will and build things from scratch, right? But when you're talking about the 59th mayor or 72nd governor or whatever it is, right? That is like imagine somebody inheriting a factory and then passing it down and passing it down again and again and again for 10 generations. you start to not have selection for competence. You just have selection for legitimacy, which is, oh yeah, they're a legitimate owner because it's the, father, son's daughter's son or whatever, right? And when you only select for legitimacy rather than competence, you want both, by the way, but when you only select for legitimacy rather than competence, when there's some unexpected thing that hits, you've got this factory that is making hats, and now market conditions have changed and men don't wear hats anymore because, like Kennedy didn't wear a hat. Well, you better change that thing to making something else, or else it's going to go out of business. And so one of the issues is inherited institutions that are set up by really great founders can seem to work for a long time until market conditions, political conditions, social conditions change, at which point they're still